Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Reedon. I wrote the Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011.
Good luck.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break, a podcast that features conversations with speedrunners, developers, content creators, and everything in between. This is episode 72, and for this one, I'm going to have a conversation with myself once more. I actually am really excited about this one because I've wanted to talk about a game that I played about 2 years ago at the beginning of 2020 that has really stuck with me and left a lasting impression on me that I still think about to this day, even though I've only played the game once, and that is The Beginner's Guide. What I'm hoping, though, is that this analyzation or look back or thinking about this game out loud hopefully leads to perhaps a bigger discussion or maybe a little bit more interesting question. And that is, what exactly makes a game a game? And so I know it's a big question, especially nowadays, as we have gotten more and more tools that allow creative folks to create experiences that almost sometimes feel like they transcend their format, whether that's gaming or movies or books or television shows or anything like that. So that's where I'm hoping this conversation is going to lead to. We'll see. I don't know. We'll try and get there. Just want to give a quick heads up that if you've never played The Beginner's Guide, I am going to spoil some of the game. But the game itself is only a couple hours long, and it's one of those things where I feel like if I discuss certain plot points, yes, it's going to spoil it. However, it's the type of game or the type of experience that you really should have on your own. It's only about 2 hours long. And even knowing spoilers, I'm not sure it's going to spoil the experience itself. So anyway, listen forward at your own risk. If it's something you don't want spoiled, I totally understand. Maybe you go back and play the game and you want to listen to this, or maybe we just call it right here and you join back after you've played the game years from now. I don't know. So I just want to put that out there right now. Okay, so where do we start with this? Well, the question I thought might be interesting to ask first is, what was like the first game that you played that may have transcended the format? And what I mean by this was was there any games that you can remember playing early on as a kid? Or maybe it's not even a game, maybe it's a movie that or a book that maybe transcended its own format. And as a kid growing up, I have all these nostalgia for video games and stuff, but having these emotional responses to a game or a movie, I didn't have too many of those, especially in the video game space where I attached on until I can remember so Metroid on the Nintendo Entertainment System is one that I really remember quite vividly, that the game itself, I actually had feelings and emotions while I was playing the game. And at the time they were like, this is creepy. And just the idea of feeling creepy from a video game was something I had never experienced before. And I can't remember, I'm probably 10 years old, 8 years old at the time. But I remember that game gave me an emotional response. And it's interesting because I'm sure there were others, but I can't think of one until around Final Fantasy VII came out, where I was in high school. And as I was playing through that game, my friend and I actually were getting the chance to play a lot of it together. I didn't have a PlayStation, he did. And it was a game that he knew he wanted to play. He had been into role-playing games before. And I remember him and I talking about we actually cared about the characters that were in the game. And I know that didn't necessarily transcend the format, but it started to get me to realize that in gaming or in any sort of storytelling medium, that you can actually create emotional attachments. And sometimes that takes you out of just the pure joy of playing a video game, which is awesome. It's amazing that you can have that experience. What is it? It's it leads you to that question, well, what does it mean then to be a video game? That's such a interesting, especially nowadays, right? So it's gotten me thinking about, and that's The Beginner's Guide is this game that I had that experience with, and I still think about the game 2 years later. I'm still thinking about the things that happen in the game. So if you're not familiar with whatever, the game is actually called The Beginner's Guide, and it's made by Davey Reedon, and he is the creator of the Stanley Parable, which looks like 2013, and they just came out with another remake of it here now in 2022. It was quite a popular game, and it obviously gave Davey the freedom and the creativity to do some things nowadays that he might not have had otherwise. It's really cool to see a game like that be successful. If you're not familiar with the Stanley Parable, it's a really interesting game that has a narrator that can be unreliable at times, and that as a player, you want to try things out that the narrator tells you, and then you also want to do some things with the narrator that are opposite of what the narrator is telling you. And I don't think that's a spoiler on the Stanley Parable, but know that this is a creator who is interested in giving people an experience that they may not be expecting with video games. So I would describe The Beginner's Guide, if you've never played it before and you're still listening to this right now, as a narrative experience. It's tough to call it specifically like a video game, because there are certain connotations nowadays where if somebody says video game, we automatically conjure some ideas of what that actually means in our head. Quite often for me, that means, okay, Link with a sword, or somebody running around on platforms, or, Doom or Halo, Master Chief with a blaster. Those are the kind of images and immediate the things I associate with gaming. It's kind of interesting, as games have gone on, I've gotten a little less away from that, but this is definitely the Beginner's Guide is definitely not one of those traditional type gamings. And it's interesting because what the Beginner's Guide does is it's a story. It's telling a story through its experience. And one of the things that I've always loved since back in the day of the original Zelda game and other RPGs that I played early on, for me it was Faxanadu, but I know I mispronounced that game and I can't remember how it was pronounced correctly, so excuse me. But there are the idea of telling a story and having it. I still to this day respond to narratives, linear narratives. And so I really appreciated this game right off the bat. And the story of the game, if you will, is the narrator is sharing with you levels, almost unfinished levels from a creator who the narrator has been interested in, whose name is Coda. And you get to experience some of the levels that the narrator has unearthed or that is sharing with you that is work from somebody else named Coda. And the first hour or so, or the first half of the game, I really felt like the Beginner's Guide was talking about just the idea and some of the struggles that one goes through during the creative process. And if you've ever done anything creative in your life, I really related to this quite a bit, because you would see, just different ideas in the levels that you're experiencing. And it's mostly like first person experiences, but that whole idea of the creative process, there's nothing more scary to a creative than the blank page, or to an editor, the blank timeline. These things are just terrifying to us, and getting over that hump can really be a challenge sometimes. And so I really had this automatic, like within the first few minutes, I was totally hooked into the narrative that was being described to me as the player. And as the game goes on, things start to reveal themselves. And I don't want to spoil it too heavy, but there is a relationship that the narrator gets deep into between the narrator and the work of Coda, who is the developer. And I don't think I need to spoil the whole thing completely, but just know that is something that the narrator is trying to express to you, the player, as you're going through this experience. And it's really just storytelling at a really high level, super interesting, always keeps you, into what's going on. And at the same time, it uses our ideas and kind of like how we normally think and experience games, but uses them as a storytelling device. And so it's got this really interesting, interactive experience to it. I keep saying experience because I'm not sure exactly how else to describe it, but I think that's really the best way to put it. And so when you get as you move on towards the last 15 or so minutes, when the game really starts to reveal itself and where the story is going, the emotions come pretty heavy. And as somebody, it's obvious, at least in my opinion, because Davey is the writer and the narrator of this game. While I think he's done this masterful job of creating this whole experience. I also think that he's revealing some things about himself within his work, and it really resonated with me that I continue to think of today. And if you're not familiar with the developer, Davey Reedon, he's never talked, or he would prefer not to discuss what goes on in the beginner's guide publicly. And so he's hoping that the piece of work speaks for itself. But he has done some talks, and they're on YouTube. We're going to link to one of them in the description here, just about his development process with the Stanley Parable and some of the things that he's posted online. I think you can, you start to make some conclusions about his work and how, the process of creativity, especially in an environment where you have to ship a game or where you have to make something that, you're relying on to put food on the table. I think it's really interesting. And the more that I think about the beginner's guide, the more that I'm appreciative of Davey sharing a piece of work like this, because it seems so personal, and it's something that if you've gotten through the entire game, it resonates with one. And I know it did with me. And I know that it made me appreciate his work, obviously, but then also appreciate his just putting his work out there to be judged by us as the player, as the people who enjoy this stuff. And I just keep thinking about how brave that is and how not easy it can be to put your creative work out there and just have the whole world judge it. And the more I think about that, the more I respect it. And the more it makes me even think about myself, for any of us who put any sort of work out into the public sphere. I would even say, even if you don't put your work out, on social media or something like that, I'm just talking about when you have to do work that somebody else has to judge, whether you're in an office environment, whether you're at school, even just doing schoolwork, right? Where you submit schoolwork and it's being judged by a teacher or a teacher's aide or something like that. And a game like this, I think just is almost, it helps cope or deal with those emotions, or at least gets us to think about them. It got me to think about them. I should talk a little more about my own experience. I'll also say that I played this game on stream, which I thought was actually it hit me so hard. I was almost, there's long times during the stream where I'm not saying anything because, and this was a while ago, but I wasn't saying anything because I was sitting in my own contemplation, what does that mean to me? And when I say what that means to me, I don't think it's giving away anything in the game, but it's not like I was trying to decipher a code. It's just there's these things that happen in the game that have emotional resonance to me. And anytime work has done that, and it's happened in some novels I've read, some nonfiction I've read, some movies I've watched, I love the idea of something that makes me continue to think about it after the experience is over. And I think those are the kind of things that change me as a person for better or for worse. I don't know. No, but hopefully for the better, where, it's allowing us, allowing me, I keep saying us, but allowing me to just kind of continue to contemplate things. And that's, I appreciated that about this game a lot. So, the thing I want to get to from kind of this basic review of the game is I've thought about how does one go about even creating something like this that is so different and format bending than, what we might consider. If I load up Unity I load up the first person shooter template or whatever and start creating my game, I'm creating a level or whatever. How would I get from that all the way over to this idea of this story that unfolds with these levels that are half made, and then you won't even finish a level and the narrator will take you and put you in a new place because the narrator's you've already experienced what the narrator wanted you to experience. Let me take a quick pause here. So, as some of you may know, I've been teaching game design this year to high school students. And one of the things we talk about is basic level design or basic game design. What are some principles that make up the basis for a game? And we even talk about genre and formats and things like that. And I think it's really interesting to perhaps explore, what does it even mean to be a game these days? Because we have so many wonderful pieces of art and wonderful pieces of creativity that it's important to understand fundamental ideas of gaming However, if somebody has a creative idea that they want to explore that may not be fit into the genre or fit into the format, how can I foster that? Or how can we as a community foster those ideas? And I know it's a big question. It's not easy to tackle. I think one of the things that's important is like having, at least some sort of foundational structure. And what I mean by that is just, I always go back to Mario level 1-1, where this is how you teach somebody to play your game or to experience your game. As I've gone back and started to think about the beginner's guide, I'm like, oh, you know what? The game actually does set you up how to experience this experience from the very beginning. And so there are some actual fundamentals of game design in beginner's guide that may not be obvious because they're so fluid and they make it so easy to experience. And I think, as the conversation that I thought might be interesting to have, and if you want to, what I mean by this is maybe throw it in some comments or join us on Discord or maybe even respond to the tweet for this episode, is what exactly does it mean to be labeled as a game? What defines a game? What exactly is that? Is there a piece of criteria we can use to define a game? And should we? Does it even need to be in this day and age? One of the interesting things, Fortnite's kind of an interesting example of this, where we're seeing all of these comic book movie characters inside of Fortnite, and people are watching movies inside of Fortnite. Roblox, Minecraft, and Roblox. These are all interesting, almost like platforms where things are happening in there that you wouldn't necessarily associate. It's not running from one side of the screen to the other. It's not trying to get the flagpole. It's not trying to, just to blow up your enemy. And it's kind of an interesting time to be in gaming to see some of these transitions as they're happening. Minecraft's a great, some people just like hanging out in Minecraft, building stuff together. They're not trying to destroy the enemy. They're literally just team building with somebody, And does that still qualify as a game, or is it quantified as a game? And I would absolutely say it does. And I'm wondering, what is the definition of, what are going to be the fundamentals of game design 10 or 20 years from now? Are they going to be the same? I don't know. I don't have the answers to these. I think that the beginner's guide has highlighted these ideas and these questions to me. And that's why I think I'm still thinking about the game 2 years after I've done playing it. And so I guess, what I'd also like, is what are the genres of gaming nowadays? When we started, I think, or when you think back to like Atari, Nintendo, Sega, or some of these early stages of gaming, I don't know if you remember going to Toys R Us or wherever you might have purchased your games or rented your games, but they did have some genres, action, puzzle. They're pretty simple. I remember eventually we got like the RPG, but there were some pretty simple genres. And have those changed at all? If I'm trying to define genre nowadays, it's tough. We have some of our basics, which we first person shooter, sports, things like this, but we're getting more and more experiences that are like the beginner's guide, where they don't necessarily fit into a box. And I think that's what's probably just been so interesting to me, and has caused more questions than it has answers. But what a great time to be alive, where we actually get to ask these questions, and this is happening. Yeah, I think if you look at any kind of creative art form, it's probably happened in almost any type of I can think of easily, times where we've asked, hey, what makes a movie, because we've had so many artists try so many different things. Same thing with the television format or episodic format, comic books, graphic novels, the novel in general, nonfiction. It is always a question that continues to be answered once when you have creative tools and creative outlets for more people than when the thing started. So I guess, the other question I want to ask, what are some of your favorite games that don't follow like traditional structures and constraints? I wanted to get more of these out there and try to get more of these experiences public, because I wouldn't have heard of the beginner's guide if it wasn't for a friend, Alaskan Emily, suggesting this. I think she actually even donated it to me. And so I'm not sure I would have ever tried this out had I had somebody not handed it to me. And as always, whenever you've played a great game, the first thing you want to do is share it with your friends, right? You want to, the world needs to know about this game. But I'm also curious at what are some of the other types of experiences or games that may be like this game that don't necessarily follow the traditional structure of basic game design, because I really feel like this one does and doesn't at times, and makes it super kind of interesting. I think you could even make an argument that at times the Stanley Parable does something similar, where it plays on what your expectations are for a game. The last kind of question, and this is one is where I think I'm more asking this of myself. And I already touched upon it a little bit, but is how do you apply, fundamental principles in new and interesting ways? As I mentioned, I think it's important to teach when you're teaching students, or even when you're trying some of these things out yourself, to understand some basic game design and try it out yourself. I'm still struggling with it as a game designer. While I am teaching this stuff, I am trying to create my own game and games at the same time. And teaching fundamental game design and actually doing it yourself, practicing fundamental game design, was way more challenging than I thought it would be. I've noticed that it's a lot easier to start with something that's already pre-built. And what I mean by that is I'm not creating new mechanics. I'm not creating some sort of new thing that didn't exist before, not some new engine or anything like that. And applying basic fundamental principles seems like a good place to start, but it's also, it can be limiting at times. So how do you try something out in that, structure? And I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. Thankfully, I have students who haven't quite asked me yet, or maybe they weren't comfortable yet in asking about how do I bend what we normally think of as a game. One of the most obvious here being the beginner's guide. It's almost a game I'd love to share with my students in that sense, because it's only a couple of hours and it's age appropriate. It's like the perfect time to influence creatives, at that stage, and teenagers, things like that. So something else to think about. What are the games? What other games can you think of that are that define or defied, expanded what it might mean to be a game? Okay, there we go. We got it out. I love this game, if you can't tell, and it's still something that I sit with and think about. And I know this is a bit shorter of an episode, but I'm curious if anybody has any feedback or wants to give any feedback. Join us in the Discord. The link's in the description. It's also in the notes for the podcast episode. If not, I totally understand. Maybe you want to shoot me a DM, because I would just love to know what other types of experiences are out there that kind of, that bend what it exactly means to be a game. If you haven't played it, do yourself a favor. Go check out the beginner's guide. It's only a couple hours. And I think it's on Steam. I think that's where I played it. I got it from on Steam. But I would also highly recommend listening to Davey Reedon's talk that he does to a university. I believe it's in the UK somewhere. I'm linking it in the description, because it's just interesting to hear what somebody at Davey's level, who is thinking about games at this really interesting way, how he goes about his process and what it's like to actually have to go through that in the real world. So super interesting. Thanks everyone for listening this week. We'll be back as always with more conversations and episodes, but have been wanting to talk about this game for quite a while, and I'm hoping I'm doing it a little bit of justice on what kind of memorable and impactful experience the beginner's guide is. Thanks for listening and watching. Thanks everyone for listening, watching, viewing, liking, subscribing, and sharing. All of that stuff goes a long way to helping out the podcast. If you'd like any additional info, you can go to sequencebreakpodcast.com. All of our past episodes, everything's on there. You'll find everything there. If you'd like to watch live, follow the Sequence Break Twitter. That is Sequence Break PC, and you can join in, ask some questions, watch the whole thing live. It does happen. It's not really a set time, but I do post when I go live. Everything else, if you have any questions or anything like that, podcast at sequencebreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.